When love dies, God can still restore your marriage. Don't give up on what He can heal. Have you ever wondered why love that once felt divine can suddenly die in silence? Why the one who used to see your soul now looks at you like a stranger? Today you'll discover the mystery behind those moments when God allows love to fade, not to destroy you, but to restore what human hands alone could never fix. Because maybe what you're living right now isn't the end of your marriage, but the moment heaven begins to rebuild it from the ashes. I've walked this road too. I've seen couples who thought everything was over find miracles where pain once ruled. I've studied and prayed with those who believed they were beyond repair, until they learned that God's silence was never rejection, only preparation. That's why I speak to you not as a preacher from afar, but as someone who has seen what divine restoration truly looks like when love seems gone. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share may completely change how you see your story, and reveal that what you thought was dead, God has already decided to bring back to life. The moment love flatlines. There comes a point in every relationship when the noise fades and what remains is silence. Not the silence of peace, but the kind that echoes with everything left unsaid. You sit across from the person you once prayed for, and somehow you feel miles apart. The laughter that once filled the house now hides behind closed doors. The touch that once brought comfort feels distant, routine, or gone. You begin to wonder when it happened, the exact moment love stopped breathing. But love rarely dies in a single blow. It fades slowly, like a candle starving for oxygen. It disappears in the small neglects, the unspoken apologies, the prayers postponed for another day. In that silence, many believe God has turned away, but He hasn't. He's right there in the stillness, not shouting over the pain, but waiting for your heart to listen again. When love flatlines, it's not the sign of God's absence, but the beginning of His work. Because sometimes He allows what was built on emotion to crumble, so that what is built on faith can finally stand. He lets the illusion fall apart to expose what was fragile and invite what is eternal. It hurts because you're watching something sacred break. Yet, even in that breaking, there's a strange mercy. The mercy of God removing what cannot last, so He can reveal what truly can. When the warmth fades, you start to question everything. Was it real? Did we ever truly love each other? These are the questions that keep you awake at night, the ones that pierce deeper than anger. But the truth is, love isn't proven by how you start. It's revealed by how you endure. When two people stop fighting for each other, it's not because the love has vanished, it's because hope has. That's why God steps in, not to condemn you for giving up, but to breathe life into the space where hope has died. You see, every marriage faces a moment of flatline. It's that stage where human strength runs out, where emotions no longer sustain what only grace can. And it's here that God whispers, "Now let me do what only I can do." When everything you tried failed, when every word led to another wound, that's when His hand begins to move. Because restoration doesn't start in comfort, it begins in surrender. It begins when pride breaks, when hearts admit they need something greater than willpower to love again. Love dies when it's lived only by feeling, but it's reborn when it's lived by choice. A choice anchored in God's promise, not in your own capacity. The day you stop expecting perfection and start inviting His presence, that's the day your story begins to change. When love flatlines, God is still in the room. He's the unseen physician reviving what you thought was lost. Every breath you thought was gone, He can restore. Every tear you thought was wasted, He has counted. This moment, the silence, the distance, the heartbreak, isn't proof that you failed. It's proof that God is preparing something deeper. You are standing at the threshold between the end of what was and the beginning of what He is about to renew. And maybe the love you had before needed to die, because what's coming next will be love resurrected, love with roots deeper, faith stronger, and grace that holds when feelings fall short. When love flatlines, don't rush to bury it. Stand beside it in faith and whisper, "God, if you can raise the dead, you can raise this too." Because love doesn't die where God still breathes. What looks lifeless to you is alive in His plan. And as long as His Spirit is near, there is always one more heartbeat left in the story, the hidden autopsy of a marriage. When love fades, most couples search for a single cause, a single moment to blame. They point to the argument that went too far, the betrayal that cracked trust, or the distance that grew silently between them. But love rarely dies from one wound. It dies from 1,000 tiny cuts that go unnoticed. It dies in the days when communication becomes convenience, when forgiveness is postponed, and when affection is replaced by habit. Slowly, without even realizing it, two people begin to live parallel lives, together in body, but distant in soul. This is the hidden autopsy of a marriage, the slow erosion that happens not in the storms, but in the stillness. At first, you think it's just a phase. You tell yourself you're tired, that life is busy, that things will get better after the next weekend or the next holiday. But something deeper is shifting. The connection that once felt sacred is quietly fading. You stop sharing dreams because dreams now feel fragile. You stop praying together because prayers feel forced. You start protecting yourself instead of your union. That's how love begins to starve. Not for lack of romance, but for lack of intention. The heart that once overflowed begins to close off, and soon both partners are living behind invisible walls they built without noticing. It's here that God's wisdom begins its work, because He never heals what we pretend isn't broken. When the soul of a marriage begins to decay, He invites us to look honestly at what lies beneath. Pride resists this examination. It whispers that you're fine, that it's your partner who needs to change. But healing never starts with accusation. It starts with confession. When you finally dare to look at your own heart, you realize the cracks that formed weren't just emotional. They were spiritual. You stopped feeding love at its source. You stopped watering the roots of patience, grace, and sacrifice that once held everything together. God often allows us to reach this breaking point so that we finally turn to Him, not as a last resort, but as the only true foundation. He wants to show that no human bond can survive when it's disconnected from its divine origin. Marriage was never meant to be sustained by willpower alone. It was meant to be a reflection of His covenant, a love that endures not because it's easy, but because it's anchored in something eternal. When couples forget this truth, they start living by emotions that change with the seasons, and soon, what was sacred becomes common. The hidden autopsy of a marriage is painful to witness, but it's also holy ground. It's the place where God reveals the truth about how we loved, how we failed, and how we can begin again. He doesn't expose the wounds to shame you. He reveals them to heal you. Because the same God who shows the cause of death also holds the power of resurrection. Every honest look at what went wrong becomes a doorway to what can still be restored. If your marriage feels like it's lying lifeless on the table, don't turn away in fear. Face the truth with courage and faith. Let God teach you where love stopped breathing and why. Only then can His Spirit breathe again into what's been buried beneath years of pain and misunderstanding. The miracle doesn't start when you hide the evidence of failure. It starts when you place it in His hands. He cannot heal what you keep pretending is whole. So if you're standing over something that seems dead, remember this: autopsy is not the end. It's revelation. It's God showing you what must die so that real love can live. Every broken piece, every regret, every tear is evidence not of failure but of invitation. An invitation to rebuild, to forgive, to return to the one who created love itself. Because when God performs the examination, He never closes the story with loss. He ends it with life. When God seems silent, but is still speaking. There comes a point when the silence between two hearts feels unbearable. Not just the silence between you and your partner, but the silence between you and God. You pray, and it feels like your words fall into an empty sky. You beg for a sign, a change, a breakthrough, and all you get in return is quiet. It's the kind of quiet that can make you question everything: your faith, your marriage, even your own worth. You start to wonder if God has turned away, if he's letting your love die without lifting a hand to save it. But silence is not the same as absence. And what you don't hear, he is still speaking, just not in the way you expect. God's silence is one of his most misunderstood languages. It doesn't mean rejection, it means preparation. In his silence, he is rearranging what you can't yet see. He is working beneath the surface, softening hearts, aligning circumstances, healing wounds you didn't know were open. The silence that feels like abandonment is often his greatest act of mercy. Because if he answered too soon, you'd settle for repair when he's planning resurrection. His quiet is not a punishment, it's a pause before revelation. Think of how many times in Scripture God did his deepest work in silence. Before the resurrection, there was a tomb, still dark and sealed. Before victory, there was a waiting season that felt endless. Before restoration, there was loss. God is not in a hurry because his miracles are never rushed. He uses silence to strip away distractions, to separate emotion from truth, to bring you face to face with what really matters. When he stops speaking the way you're used to hearing him, it's because he's teaching you to listen in a deeper way, not with your ears, but with your spirit. When marriages fall into silence, couples often mirror that same divine tension. You speak, but you're not heard. You love, but it's not returned. You pray together, and nothing changes. And yet, that silence can become sacred ground. It's in that stillness that God invites you to stop talking at him and start trusting in him, to realize that the silence itself is a conversation, one where he's teaching you endurance, faith, and patience. Love cannot grow without silence, because silence is where roots go deep. Sometimes God allows the noise to fade, so he can heal what only quiet can reach. When you no longer hear his voice in the way you want, he's inviting you to experience his presence in a new dimension. Through peace that doesn't make sense, through forgiveness that feels impossible, through strength that comes from nowhere. He's still speaking in your pain, through the people you least expect, in the moments when you almost give up. Every delay, every unanswered prayer, every sleepless night is a word in his language of transformation. When you stop fighting the silence and start resting in it, you begin to feel something shift. Not everything will be fixed at once, but something inside you will awaken, a quiet certainty that God is not done, that he's not punishing you, he's preparing you. The silence you feared becomes proof that he's near, because when he is silent, he's not gone. He's sculpting your faith. He's forming the kind of love that isn't fragile, that doesn't depend on constant reassurance, but stands firm because it knows who holds the story. So, if God seems silent in your marriage right now, don't let despair speak louder than his stillness. What you call silence, heaven calls sacred work. Trust that while you see nothing, he is rebuilding everything. Trust that what feels like the end is only the middle of his miracle. When God seems silent, he is still speaking. In whispers only the waiting heart can hear. The battle between ego and covenant. Every marriage faces a battlefield that no one sees, the war between ego and covenant. It's not the arguments that destroy love, it's the invisible fight to be right instead of being united. Ego says, "I'll protect myself." Covenant says, "I'll protect us." Ego demands to be heard. Covenant chooses to understand. One builds walls, the other builds bridges. And somewhere between these two forces, the soul of a marriage is decided. Most relationships don't die because of lack of love. They die because pride takes the place of humility, and self-preservation replaces surrender. When two hearts stand before God and make vows, they enter into a sacred covenant, not a contract of convenience, but a divine promise sealed in heaven. A contract says, "I'll stay as long as you give me what I want." A covenant says, "I'll stay even when you don't." That's the difference between human love and divine love. Human love quits when it hurts. Divine love kneels when it bleeds. But as life happens, disappointments, fatigue, unmet expectations, ego starts to whisper, "You deserve better, you shouldn't have to try so hard." And if that whisper goes unchecked, It becomes a wall so thick that even prayer struggles to pass through. Ego doesn't always scream. Sometimes it hides behind silence, sarcasm, indifference. It wears the disguise of strength, but it's built from fear. Fear of rejection, fear of losing control, fear of being vulnerable again. Yet covenant love calls us to a different kind of strength, one that doesn't dominate but serves, one that doesn't demand but gives. It calls us to love not because it's fair, but because it's holy. God's design for marriage was never two perfect people living without conflict. It was two imperfect souls learning to die to self so that real love can live. When ego wins, love loses oxygen. When covenant wins, God breathes life again. The battle isn't fought with words or emotions. It's fought in the secret place where you choose forgiveness instead of revenge, prayer instead of pride. Every time you choose to love when it's hardest, you wage war against the enemy who wants to convince you that it's over. The devil doesn't need to destroy your marriage, he only needs to feed your pride, because pride will do the rest. But humility invites heaven into your home. God never asked you to win every argument. He asked you to guard the covenant. The strength of a marriage is not measured by how perfect it looks, but by how willing both hearts are to surrender. The cross wasn't comfortable, yet it became the greatest act of love. In the same way, true marriage isn't always peaceful, but it's redemptive. It's where two people learn that the goal is not to win against each other, but to win together against everything trying to separate them. When you finally lay down your ego, something miraculous happens. You begin to see your partner not as your rival, but as your reflection. Someone broken just like you, in need of the same grace. You stop asking, who's right, and start asking, how can we heal? That shift is where God steps in, because where pride resists, His Spirit cannot dwell. But where humility enters, restoration begins. So if your marriage feels like a battlefield, maybe the fight isn't with your spouse at all. Maybe it's with yourself. Maybe God is asking you to surrender not to defeat, but to deliverance. Because when you choose covenant over ego, heaven fights for you, and the love that once seemed lost is reborn, not in your strength but in His mercy. The spirit of division. When the enemy enters through the cracks, division never arrives loudly. It begins as a whisper, a subtle thought that says, you deserve more, or they'll never change. It slips through the smallest cracks. The sigh you didn't explain, the disappointment you didn't forgive, the prayer you stopped praying. What once was a bond of unity becomes a collection of quiet resentments, each one building a wall between two souls, meant to stand as one. That's how the enemy works, not through sudden chaos, but through gradual corrosion. He doesn't destroy love all at once. He weakens it through the daily absence of grace. Every time you choose silence instead of conversation, sarcasm instead of kindness, distance instead of vulnerability, the enemy gains ground. The spirit of division doesn't attack your love directly. It attacks your humility. It convinces you that reconciliation is weakness, that your partner's flaws are unforgivable, that your pain entitles you to stop trying. But division never starts in the marriage bed. It starts in the heart. It begins when two people forget that they are not each other's enemies, but allies in a spiritual war. God created marriage to be a reflection of His unity, a living example of how love conquers difference. But where unity reigns, the enemy seeks to sow separation. He knows that if he can divide your hearts, he can silence your prayers. That's why Scripture calls for vigilance, not paranoia, but awareness. When small irritations become emotional distance, that's the moment to fight, not with words, but with prayer. Because what starts as a misunderstanding can become an open door for bitterness if it's not surrendered to God. Division feeds on pride, but unity grows through humility. The moment one heart decides to humble itself, to forgive, to listen, to reach out even when it hurts, the enemy loses his power. The spirit of division cannot stand where love kneels. Every act of grace is a declaration that God, not resentment, rules this home. And though pride may whisper, "Let them make the first move," humility answers, "I will go first." That single decision to choose peace over pride can disarm the entire battle. When couples forget they're on the same side, they begin to fight for victory instead of healing. The enemy rejoices in those moments because every time you try to win against your spouse, you both lose. God's design was never about who's right, but about who's willing to protect the covenant. The spirit of division cannot destroy a marriage guarded by prayer, because prayer binds what pride tries to tear apart. You cannot pray for someone and hate them at the same time. Prayer transforms resentment into compassion, distance into empathy, coldness into warmth. If your marriage feels divided, don't treat it as fate. Treat it as warfare. This is not just emotional conflict, it's spiritual territory. Every harsh word, every cold silence, every unspoken wound is a chance to either open the door to darkness or to close it with forgiveness. The Bible says that a house divided against itself cannot stand, but the same truth carries its opposite promise. A house united in Christ cannot fall. Even if the cracks are deep, God can fill them. Even if the enemy has entered, he can be cast out. Division can masquerade as self-protection, but love's true protection comes from surrender. Don't wait until the house collapses to start repairing the foundation. Every prayer, every apology, every act of humility is a brick of restoration in God's hands. The spirit of division has no authority over a heart that still believes in reconciliation. And the same God who once brought two strangers together can bring them back again, stronger, wiser, and rooted in a love that no enemy can destroy. When one heart still believes, every marriage reaches a moment when only one heart is still holding on. One still prays while the other walks away. One still believes while the other doubts. One keeps hoping while the other says it's over. It's in that moment that love feels most unfair, when faith becomes lonely, when effort feels one-sided, and when the silence of the other person echoes louder than your own prayers. But God has a way of honoring even a single heart that refuses to give up. Because when one heart believes, heaven moves. You may think it's useless to keep trying, that love can't survive without two people fighting for it. But the truth is, restoration often begins with one. One who prays when it hurts, forgives when it's not deserved, and believes when it no longer makes sense. God never needed a crowd to start a miracle. He only needed one willing heart. One Noah built the ark. One Esther stood before the king. One Jesus carried the cross. And sometimes one husband or one wife standing in faith can shift an entire destiny. The world says, move on. But faith says, hold on a little longer. This isn't about desperation or denial. It's about trust. Trust that if God placed this covenant in your hands, He still has a purpose for it. Every tear you've cried in silence is a seed, and God sees it. He collects every prayer you whispered through exhaustion and disappointment. Nothing you've done in faith has been wasted. Love that endures through pain becomes a testimony of divine strength. Sometimes the one who stays is not the stronger one, just the one who understands what the vow truly meant. To love in health and sickness, in joy and sorrow, in presence and absence. To stand when the other can't, that's not weakness, that's spiritual maturity. You're not waiting for your partner to change, you're waiting for God to transform both hearts. When you stand firm, your faith becomes a shelter for the one who has lost theirs. You become the lighthouse guiding them back home. There will be days when you feel like giving up, when the silence feels endless, when hope feels foolish. But those are the moments heaven leans closest, because faith that persists in the dark has a power that faith in the light never needs to learn. God never ignores the heart that chooses love in pain. You may not see it yet, but every prayer you speak is shaping the soil of your future. What you think is delay might be divine timing, the slow unfolding of something stronger than what broke. Do not confuse stillness with failure. Sometimes God asks you to stand still not because He's forgotten, but because He's fighting for you. You don't have to fix what only grace can heal. Keep doing what's right, even when it feels unseen. Keep choosing patience, kindness, forgiveness. Because the moment you let bitterness win, you close the door to the miracle that's already on its way. Love may look lifeless now, but faith is the breath that keeps it alive until God calls it back to life. So, if you're the only one still believing, don't let shame tell you you're foolish. You're standing in the gap between what is broken and what will be restored. And while others may call it naive, heaven calls it faith. God doesn't need both hearts awake to begin. He only needs one that still believes in His power to raise the dead. And the day will come when the love that seemed buried will rise again, not through your strength, but through the faithfulness of the one who never stopped believing in you. The wilderness season, God's workshop for the brokenhearted. There comes a time when love feels like a desert, dry, endless, and silent. You wake up next to the same person, but the warmth is gone. The laughter has disappeared. The promises once spoken with conviction now feel like distant echoes in a barren land. It's in this wilderness that many give up, believing God has abandoned them. But what if this season of emptiness isn't punishment, but preparation? What if the wilderness is not where love dies, but where faith learns to breathe again? In the Bible, every person who was called by God walked through a wilderness. Moses fled to it before he became a leader. David hid in it before he became a king. Jesus faced it before he began his ministry. The wilderness is not a place of rejection. It's the place where God strips away everything that competes with His voice. When your marriage feels like it's wandering without direction, that's not evidence that He's left you. It's proof that He's rebuilding you. Because in the wilderness, He removes the noise so you can finally hear Him again. It's a painful process, because the wilderness exposes what comfort hides. It brings to light the fears, insecurities, and unresolved wounds that busyness used to cover. In marriage, this often means facing truths we've avoided, the pride that refuses to apologize, the bitterness that poisons small moments, the expectations that no one could ever meet. God leads us into the wilderness not to break us, but to refine us. Like gold in fire, He burns away what cannot remain so that what's pure can finally shine. When love feels lost, the temptation is to escape, to fill the silence with distraction, to search for new beginnings without learning from the old. But in the wilderness, escape only leads to more emptiness. Healing comes when you stay, when you stop running from the pain and start walking through it with God. The wilderness is not meant to destroy you, it's meant to transform you. It teaches you how to love without conditions, to forgive without being asked, and to trust without understanding. It's where you learn that peace doesn't depend on what happens around you, but on who walks beside you. The wilderness season humbles the heart. It takes away everything that seemed stable so you can rediscover what is eternal. It's where God teaches you that your spouse cannot be your savior. Only He can. When the human love you depended on fades, divine love takes its place. It's there, in the dust and silence, that you begin to realize God's presence is not tied to the comfort of what used to be. He's not waiting on the other side of the wilderness. He's walking with you through it. If you're in that place now, where everything feels lifeless and God feels distant, remember this. Even in the desert, there's manna. Even in drought, there's a hidden spring. The same God who led you into this place already planned your way out. The wilderness is not the end of your marriage. It's the soil where restoration grows. You may not see fruit yet, but roots are forming beneath the surface. The silence that scares you today is the same silence where God is whispering life back into what you thought was gone. So don't curse the wilderness. Don't despise this season of waiting. Embrace it as God's workshop, a sacred place where He takes the broken pieces of your heart and shapes them into something whole. Because when the wilderness ends, and it always does, you will emerge with a love purified by fire, a faith that doesn't shake, and a peace that no storm can steal. The wilderness is not where you lose everything. It's where you learn that in God, you already have everything that truly matters. The science of the soul. How love rewires through forgiveness. Forgiveness is one of the hardest miracles to live. It doesn't come from emotion, but from revelation. It's the moment when pain no longer dictates your choices, when your heart begins to heal, even if nothing around you has changed. People often think forgiveness means agreeing with what was done or pretending it didn't hurt. But true forgiveness is freedom, not for the one who hurt you, but for the one who refuses to live chained to the past. In marriage, forgiveness is not optional. It's oxygen. Without it, love suffocates slowly under the weight of resentment. When God calls you to forgive, He's not asking you to erase the memory. He's asking you to release the poison. Unforgiveness is like trying to punish someone by drinking the poison yourself. It kills joy, steals peace, and blinds you to the possibility of restoration. The longer you hold it, the heavier it becomes until every word, every glance, every prayer feels filtered through the pain of what happened. But forgiveness breaks that pattern. It's the divine reset of the soul. It allows God to step in where bitterness once ruled. Science has discovered what Scripture revealed long ago. The act of forgiving changes your brain. It lowers stress, softens the body's response to trauma, and rewires neural pathways that were shaped by anger and fear. Spiritually, forgiveness does the same thing to the soul. It rewires your heart to feel again, to hope again, to love again. It's not a one-time act. It's a process, a journey of surrendering your right to revenge and replacing it with your desire for peace. Every time you choose to let go, you train your soul to align with grace. Many people wait to forgive until they feel ready. But forgiveness doesn't start with feelings. It starts with obedience. God doesn't ask you to forgive because the other deserves it. He asks because you deserve peace. When you forgive, you step out of the prison of yesterday and walk into the freedom of today. It's not weakness, it's strength in its purest form. The same Spirit that empowered Jesus to forgive those who nailed him to the cross now empowers you to forgive the one who hurt you the most. Forgiveness also restores clarity. Pain distorts perception. It makes the one you love look like your enemy. But forgiveness restores vision. You begin to see the person, not the wound. You remember that the one who failed you is also human, broken and in need of mercy. Forgiveness doesn't guarantee immediate reconciliation, but it creates the space where reconciliation becomes possible. It's the bridge God uses to bring hearts back together, stronger and more compassionate than before. There's a moment when you forgive and nothing seems to change. You still remember the words, the betrayal, the silence. But something unseen begins to move. The soul, once trapped in the past, starts to breathe again. God begins to pour peace where anger once lived. Slowly, you realize that forgiveness wasn't about them at all. It was about your healing. Because when you forgive, you make room for God to work where your pain once stood in His way. If you're waiting for an apology that never came, don't let that hold your healing hostage. Forgiveness is not permission, it's release. It's saying, "You no longer control my peace." The one who hurt you may never say sorry, but God will. He will make beauty from ashes, light from darkness, and wholeness from what was shattered. When you forgive, you take your heart out of the enemy's hands and place it back in God's. That's how love rewires, not through forgetting, but through forgiving. And when that transformation happens, you'll discover that what once broke you has now become the very place where God's love flows most powerfully through you. The rebirth of intimacy. Real intimacy isn't built in the rush of passion. It's born in the quiet after the storm. When two hearts have been wounded, closeness feels foreign. You long for connection, but fear the vulnerability it requires. You miss the touch, but not the pain that came before it. You crave conversation, but silence feels safer. Yet God never designed love to survive in distance. True intimacy begins not when you feel close again, but when you decide to open your heart in faith, even when it still trembles. In the aftermath of conflict, the greatest miracle is not romance returning overnight, but trust, slowly learning how to walk again. Intimacy doesn't mean everything is perfect. It means you've both chosen to see one another through God's eyes. It's rediscovering the person behind the pain, remembering the laughter that once came so easily, and allowing grace to rebuild what pride destroyed. This kind of love isn't shallow, it's sacred. It doesn't demand perfection, it embraces humanity. When God restores intimacy, He doesn't start with the body, He starts with the soul. He teaches you to listen again, to speak with gentleness, to forgive with depth. He reminds you that connection isn't only physical, it's spiritual. It's two spirits learning once more to trust His rhythm, to lean into His presence together. The rebirth of intimacy happens when both hearts learn to rest in honesty. No masks, no pretense, no pretending everything is fine. Just truth, humility, and the courage to try again. Sometimes the most intimate moment between two people isn't a kiss or an embrace, but a simple conversation that begins with, "I'm still here." In that moment, heaven enters the room. Because God's love is not only found in passion, it's found in patience. The same God who created fire also created endurance. He knows that love without intimacy is survival, not life. And He didn't create you to just survive. He created you to thrive in connection, to reflect His own relational heart. The rebirth of intimacy requires humility, but it also requires hope. It asks you to believe that hearts once closed can open again, that laughter can return to rooms that once held tears. Intimacy is not built on forgetting the past, it's built on redeeming it. Every scar becomes a testimony of the grace that held you. Every flaw becomes a reminder that love is not about deserving, it's about giving. When you learn to love from that place, even brokenness becomes beautiful. And as the walls fall, you begin to feel something holy stirring again. Not the rush of infatuation, but the peace of belonging. You hold hands not to fix what's broken, but to celebrate what survived. You speak softly, not because you're afraid to argue, but because you've learned that kindness carries more power than pride. That's when intimacy truly returns, when your heart no longer needs to win, only to connect. So if your marriage feels cold, don't chase the spark. Invite the Spirit. Ask God to breathe warmth into what's frozen. Ask Him to teach you again how to see, touch, and cherish with purpose. Intimacy is not a feeling that returns on its own. It's a sacred fire that must be tended with faith. And when it burns again, it won't be like it was before. It will be deeper, quieter, more eternal. Because this time, it won't just be two hearts trying. It will be God Himself living between them. Building altars, not walls. Every marriage builds something. Some build walls so high that even love can't climb them, while others build altars, sacred places where forgiveness, grace, and humility meet. The truth is that every argument, every misunderstanding, every wound offers you a choice. Will you build a wall to protect your pride or an altar to restore your covenant? Walls feel safer at first. They keep you from being hurt again, but they also keep you from being healed. Altars, on the other hand, require vulnerability. They demand that you kneel, not to lose, but to let God win. Walls are built from fear. They say, "I'll never let you close enough to hurt me again." But love was never meant to exist behind fortresses. The moment you stop letting your spouse in, you also shut God out. Because love doesn't grow in isolation, it grows in surrender. An altar isn't a piece of furniture, it's a posture of the heart. It's the moment when both of you lay your pain, your ego, your disappointments before God and say, "We can't carry this anymore." That's where real restoration begins. Not when you prove your point, but when you both decide that peace matters more than pride. The Bible is filled with altars, places where ordinary people met God in extraordinary ways. Abraham built one to thank God for His promise. Jacob built one after wrestling with his past. Elijah built one before witnessing fire fall from heaven. Every altar was built after a struggle, never before it. In marriage, the altar symbolizes the same truth. You build it not when things are easy, but when they're breaking. When words have failed and strength is gone, that's when you stop defending and start surrendering. Because where walls divide, altars unite. Walls make you focus on who's wrong. Altars make you focus on what's right, the presence of God still willing to move. When you choose to build an altar instead of a wall, you choose relationship over revenge, mercy over memory. You invite heaven into the space where both of you once shut each other out. At the altar, you don't argue. You listen. You don't accuse. You confess. You don't control. You release. And in that sacred exchange, God begins to do what only He can, turning conflict into communion, ashes into beauty, silence into song. If you've been living behind walls, it's time to start building again. Not from fear, but from faith. Tear down the barriers that keep you apart. Every apology is a brick of grace. Every prayer together is a foundation stone. Every act of humility is mortar that binds what once was breaking. You don't need perfect tools to build an altar. You just need willing hearts. Because God doesn't bless perfection, He blesses surrender. He takes the ruins of what pride destroyed and turns them into a temple where His presence dwells. When you build walls, you end up alone in your fortress. When you build an altar, you end up together at the feet of God. And that's where every great love is reborn. Not in the moments when everything feels right, but in the moments when both hearts admit they need divine help. So if you're tired of fighting, stop defending your walls and start building your altar. Let this be the place where love begins again, where peace replaces pain, and where you both remember that the promise you made was never just between two people. It was made before the one who still believes in both of you. The proof of resurrection. There comes a moment after all the breaking, silence, and surrender when something begins to shift. You can't always explain it, but you feel it. A quiet warmth returning to a place that's been cold for too long. Words that once wounded begin to soften. Laughter finds its way back into rooms that had forgotten it. You start to see glimpses of what once was, not as a painful memory, but as a living promise being renewed. This is the proof of resurrection. When love that seemed buried begins to breathe again. It's not a theory, not wishful thinking. It's the tangible evidence that God has touched what human effort could not. The resurrection of love rarely happens all at once. It's not a flash of light or a single miracle moment. It's a series of small, holy resurrections. Quiet mornings when forgiveness outweighs frustration. Evenings when peace finally sits at the same table as pain. Days when you look at each other and realize that the same God who restored your faith is restoring your hearts. These are not coincidences. They are divine signatures. Proof that the author of your story hasn't finished writing. When Jesus rose from the dead, He didn't look exactly the same. His body still carried scars, reminders of the suffering He endured. And yet those scars became proof of victory, not defeat. In marriage, it's the same. The love that comes back doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. The scars of betrayal, the wounds of words, the seasons of distance, all become evidence that grace is stronger than pain. You'll never forget what broke you, but you'll remember what healed you even more. The proof of resurrection isn't only in what changes around you, it's in what changes within you. Where there was bitterness, you now feel compassion. Where there was fear, you now sense peace. Where there was exhaustion, you now find strength that doesn't come from you. That's how you know it's God. Because the healing feels deeper than understanding, and the love feels larger than explanation. You begin to see your partner not as the source of your pain, but as the miracle of your endurance. You start to realize that God wasn't just saving your marriage, He was transforming your hearts to love the way He loves. Through scars, through grace, through faith that outlasts the storm. Every marriage that has witnessed resurrection carries a quiet authority, not of perfection but of survival. The world may not understand it. People may ask why you stayed, why you forgave, why you still believe. But you know the answer, because you saw God in the ashes. You felt Him breathe life into what was gone. And once you've witnessed resurrection, you can never again doubt His power to restore. That's the testimony no one can take from you. So if you're beginning to see small signs of life, A softened word, a shared prayer, a gentle glance. Don't dismiss them. They are the heartbeat of something divine. Protect it, nurture it, celebrate it. Because the same Spirit that raised Jesus from the dead now lives in you, working in your marriage, reviving what the world called dead. This is your proof. Not that everything is perfect, but that God is present. The resurrection of love is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. It's where gratitude replaces grief, where laughter returns with purpose, and where two hearts finally realize that what they have is not what they lost. It's what was reborn. The proof of resurrection is not in words, but in the quiet miracle of two people who still choose each other every day. Not because it's easy, but because God made what was impossible, possible again. The divine signature, when God writes the last chapter. Every story that belongs to God ends with redemption, even the ones written in pain, even the ones we thought were over. There's a moment when all the striving stops, when every prayer you've whispered through tears finally begins to make sense. It's when you look back and realize that the journey, every heartbreak, every silence, every surrender, was never random. It was the hand of God shaping a testimony you couldn't have written yourself. That is the divine signature, the unmistakable mark of a God who finishes what he starts. When God writes the last chapter of your marriage, it doesn't read like a fairy tale. It reads like grace. It doesn't erase the scars, it redeems them. It doesn't deny the pain, it transforms it into purpose. You'll still remember the nights you almost gave up, the days you questioned his plan, the moments when love seemed beyond saving. But now those memories carry a new meaning. They've become proof of his faithfulness, because the story you thought was broken beyond repair is now the story that will heal others who are walking through the same valley. There is something sacred about reaching the end of yourself and finding that God was there all along. When you had no more strength, he carried you. When you ran out of words, he spoke for you. When your love died, he gave you his. That's what it means for God to write the final word. It's not about restoring what you had, but about creating something new, something eternal, something that reflects his love, not just your longing. The ending he writes is never a return to the past. It's the birth of a new beginning built on forgiveness, understanding, and divine peace. The divine signature is subtle, but undeniable. It shows up in the laughter that comes without effort, in the peace that makes no sense, in the quiet unity that feels unshakable. It's in the moment you realize that the miracle isn't that you survived, it's that you can love again without fear. The hands that once trembled with pain now hold with purpose. The voices that once shouted now whisper prayers together. The home that once felt heavy now carries the fragrance of grace. That's how you know God has written the last chapter, because everything that once felt broken now points back to him. Every couple who has walked through the fire of heartbreak and still stands together becomes living proof of this truth. Love sustained by God cannot die. It can bend, it can break, it can lose its way, but it will always return to its source. Because divine love doesn't depend on emotion, it depends on covenant. When God signs his name at the end of your story, it means the war is over. It means the lesson is complete. It means that the love you now hold is no longer yours to protect. It's his to sustain. So if you're standing at what feels like the end, remember this. God's endings are never empty. They're full of resurrection, full of light, full of purpose. What he restores, he strengthens. What he renews, he makes unbreakable. The same hand that allowed the storm now commands the calm. The same voice that was silent now speaks peace into your heart. You are not closing a chapter in defeat. You are watching God write his signature of victory across the pages of your life. And when the final line is written, it won't say the end. It will say it is finished. Not in despair, but in triumph. Because the story of your love was never about you alone. It was about the God who specializes in resurrection, who turns mourning into joy, ashes into beauty, and endings into beginnings. He is the author, the redeemer, and the finisher of every love that dares to trust him to write the last chapter.